Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How important is international trade to raise the quality of life, enhance the standard of living in many areas, in fact, every country around the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you're interested in our programs, please go to the website and download our shows. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as a public service to better help people understand how we're living in an interdependent world and that events that take place in Frankfort, Kentucky, or Frankfurt, Germany, or Lima, Ohio, or Lima, Peru do impact us, and they will many times make a difference in our lives. Today we're taking a look at international trade and why it is important. My guest today is an expert on international trade. My guest today is His Excellency Douglas George, who is the Consul General of Canada in Detroit. And Mr. George is responsible for the states of Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. He is a career diplomat with over 30 years of experience and most recently served as Canada's ambassador to Kuwait. Your Excellency, Douglas George, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
I'm very pleased to be back.
Well, yes, we did this about 2.5 years ago.
Yes.
Great to have you back again, and we'll just build on what we did 2.5 years ago. Let's talk a little bit about, first off, what is your role as Consul General in the 4 states, covering those 4 states that I mentioned?
Yes. In the United States, we have an ambassador and a large embassy in Washington. But because of the complexity of our relationship with the U.S., we have 12 consulate generals around the U.S. Each consul general is responsible for usually around 4 states. And we provide more immediate and more detailed meetings and relations with each of our 4 states, the state governors. We provide advocacy. We support Canadian businesses looking to do business in one of our 4 states, and we provide consular services to Canadians in distress. And we work very closely with each other. We basically function as a network with the ambassador at the head, and we're working with him throughout on all of our issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the opening, I mentioned international trade is so critical to improve the standard of living, the quality of life of people. Is that correct? Why is international trade important?
Well, international trade basically allows countries to specialize in certain areas. It allows us to be more efficient and more competitive. And it also, if you're working in the area of international trade, those jobs tend to pay better. So it helps, if you look at Kentucky, Kentucky is a relatively small state, mm-hmm. but a major exporter. They're dealing not just with other states in the Union, but with Canada and countries around the world. They produce all the Corvettes. You're not going to drive all the Corvettes just in Kentucky. You're exporting them around the world.
Exactly. And yes. You hit upon a very important, several important points. One is the size. Kentucky is a relatively small state, 42,000 square miles, about 70,000 square kilometers. Canada's 3.5 million square miles and about 5 million square kilometers. You've got 35 million people, 10 provinces, 3 territories. We've got about 4.2 million people. That's quite a that's a huge area for Kentucky to interact in. Where are Kentucky industries focusing on in Canada? There's certain areas, certain industries that they're focusing on. Then we'll talk about Canadian industries in Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, if you want to look at Canada-Kentucky trade, I think the first thing you have to understand is we are Kentucky's biggest customer. Mm-hmm. For your export markets, we buy more from you than the EU, UK, China, Mexico. In fact, we buy more than China, Mexico, and the UK combined. We take more than a quarter of your exports. And the major areas that we're dealing in, a lot of it is auto parts, automobiles, finished automobiles, and it's a two-way trade. Because your biggest exports to us are autos and auto parts. Our biggest exports to you are autos and auto parts, because we have cross-border trade in auto parts. One of the biggest growing, the next biggest area, but growing the fastest, is aviation and aerospace. Kentucky is booming in aviation and aerospace. And I'm pleased to say that while it's farther down the list, one of your exports that's really growing to Canada is bourbon.
Yes.
It's gone up significantly in the last few years.
That's a very important product, very important export. That's very, very true. You were talking about aviation. Now, we don't have in Kentucky, and maybe you do in Canada, we don't have a Boeing aircraft assembly plant or anything here, but what are some of the areas that we're involved in that are of interest to the Canadians and vice versa?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. I just came from an aviation roundtable where we had the Lieutenant Governor, the Deputy Premier of Quebec, and a number of aviation companies, both from Canada and Kentucky. It is the largest sector of the Kentucky economy in terms of exports. You have 596 companies involved in aviation. We have major equipment manufacturers, Bombardier Aircraft and Bell Helicopters assemble final aircraft. But all of them depend on parts coming from basically all around the world. And so we have a number of Kentucky companies that are providing parts to Canada. We also have Canadians providing parts and expertise down to Kentucky.
I saw some statistics not long ago. One statistic was that Kentucky's largest export, you mentioned bourbon, which is very big, thoroughbreds, but also our number one export is aviation engines.
Yes.
Engines for aircrafts, and these are built primarily by GE, as I recall. So that is something that comes as a surprise to many of us in Kentucky, that we're that involved in that industry.
And if you look at a finished aircraft, over a third of the cost of the aircraft is usually the engines. So it's a very precise, no tolerance for error industry where you need highly trained workers and perfection, basically. And so one of the areas I was discussing last fall with the Lieutenant Governor, and we discussed again today, was training and talent. Because of the advanced industries that both of us are moving toward, you need talented people. You need to be training up people, and it's not something you can train in a few hours. I was talking to someone who said that when they get a worker on the line, they have to work with them for a full year before they can trust them on their own. And Quebec, especially in the Montreal area, has a really great system on training technicians, engineers, and people who come up with the concept. So basically, it's probably the only place in the world where you can start with a blank sheet of paper and end up with a fully assembled aircraft. It was within 50 miles of Montreal. And we're happy to pass on that expertise. But in areas like automotive, other machine tools and other things, you really need a high level of expertise. And when I talk to people, whether it's Kentucky, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, or Canada, they're often, one of their biggest issues is finding the right talented people. But we're all working toward that.
Training is so critical. Of course, the educational system, the universities, the secondary school systems, all the trade schools are all absolutely critical in helping to properly train people to fill these high-tech jobs. And these are the ones that are high-paying jobs. We see in Kentucky, we see many jobs that are dying. The coal industry is dying quickly, primarily because of fracking and that type of thing, natural gas. But a lot of those jobs, most of those jobs are never coming back. But to retrain these coal miners is absolutely critical to get them into other jobs, to work in plants that are building solar power plates or something like that, whatever it might be. You know, we were talking about Canada, and again, Canada is the second, I mentioned, the second largest country land-wise, right behind Russia.
Yes.
In the world. You got a relatively small population, but you've got 10 very large provinces. In Kentucky, we have 120 counties, fairly small counties, to be quite honest. How do are a large number of the other provinces operating in Canada, for example, Manitoba, British Columbia, different ones like that? Do they have outreach to have international trade activities with other areas of Kentucky?
Yeah, the two largest are Ontario, which is the seat of our automotive industry, and Quebec, which is the seat of our aerospace industry. But other provinces are dealing regularly, company by company with Kentucky. If you're buying energy, if you're buying oil, if you're buying petroleum products, Canada's the United States' #1 supplier of all forms of energy. A lot of Americans don't realize this, but we supply 43% of the U.S.'s petroleum products. And, I'd ask you if you're looking at a foreign supplier for petroleum, oil, and natural gas, who do you want to work with? Countries that are in conflict zones, have questionable environmental standards, could have trade disrupted, or your closest friend and ally that's just across the border. Now that's maybe an unfair question, but I think it shows the importance of our two-way trade, and it's something that we're working hard to make sure runs smoothly.
It certainly ties into any business person's plan, their business plan.
Yes.
They certainly look at that. And of course, you are, as you said, the largest trade partner with the United States,
Yeah.
and you're just right across the border. In fact, you're within 2 or 3 hours of a large percentage of the population of the United States. If you go all the way across from Washington all the way over to Maine in that area, but it's a very optimal relationship for both parties. Now, before I forget, I do want to put out your website. Our viewers can go to detroit.gc.ca if they would like to tap into your website to see more about what you're doing. You were talking about training people too. What do the Canadians work with, say, businesses in Kentucky to help give them an idea of what Canadian consumers want? Do you work on trade missions? Will there be a Canadian trade? I know you're available 24/7, but
Yeah.
will you have missions coming from Ontario or from Quebec down to Kentucky, or missions from Kentucky going to Canada to promote your products, or vice versa?
Well, we've had a number of missions over the years from Kentucky bringing interested businesses north to Canada. We've had people coming the other way. A very special event at the moment is we have the Deputy Premier, would be the equivalent of Lieutenant Governor. Deputy Premier of Quebec is here for a few days, meeting with some companies, meeting with schools, meeting with politicians, and spoke at today's Aviation Roundtable, basically promoting Kentucky-Quebec relations. My office is Canada-wide. We promote all of Canada working with Kentucky, and I have a number of specialists in my area, an automotive specialist, an aviation specialist, an agricultural specialist, who work with businesses to help them, if they want to access innovative products, high quality inputs from Canada, they can come to us. If they're looking to invest in Canada to be closer to their markets, we've got some good advantages. And my foreign policy and diplomacy section helps advocate Canadian interests and help explain Canada to Kentuckians, and part of our job is explaining Kentucky's policy to Canadian politicians so they understand what's happening here. Excuse me.
Yes, please. Now, do you have a ballpark figure? I know we're talking about a multitude of industries. You're talking about aviation, talking about automobile, talking about bourbon, just a wide range of industries. But do we have a ballpark figure of how many, let's say the amount of the goods purchased by Canadians as opposed by Kentuckians or by folks in the United States? I know the trade balance is pretty even. As I recall, it's pretty balanced. At least I heard that the other day. I don't know if that's true, but do you have a ballpark figure of how many billions of dollars in trade will go either way, or both ways, really?
Well, if you want to look Canada-U.S. wide, trade in goods and services amounts to roughly $2 billion per day.
Per day?
And 400,000 people crossing the border per day. And as you said, the trade balance between Canada and the U.S. is roughly in balance. You know, it shifts from year to year, but it's basically balanced and mutually beneficial. If you want to look at Kentucky and Canada, you sell us around $7.2 billion in goods and services every year. We sell you 3.7. So the trade balance with Kentucky is in your favor, but you know that changes from state to state. Across the United States, 35 of the 50 states have Canada as their number one export destination, number one trading partner. And if you look at all 48 of the 50 have Canada as number 1, 2, or 3. So we're a fairly important trading partner to Canada, to the U.S., and that was recognized when Prime Minister Trudeau met with President Trump on Monday. That this is a very important and vital relationship to both countries, and we need to do what we can to improve it. Keep it going and see what we can do to improve it.
And they, as I recall, set up a U.S.-Canada Council for the Advancement of Women Business Leaders / Female Entrepreneurs.
Yes.
That sounds like a very important operation that can be of great assistance to women entrepreneurs.
Well, it fits in with at least the Trudeau government's approach. Our foreign minister, who used to be trade minister, Madame Freeland, has been promoting women entrepreneurs and women business as part of her broader portfolio. This is an opportunity for us to work together with the U.S. And advance. It's not the only thing they did, but it's an important thing they did. And in some ways it echoes how the Prime Minister has been approaching things. When he announced his cabinet a little over a year ago, it was 15 men and 15 women. And the press asked him, why did you do that? And he said, it's 2015. It was,
get with the program.
Yeah. And, but they also discussed any number of other things, how we could improve both the efficiency and security of trade across our shared border. We've been doing things like working to reduce regulatory burden on both sides. We each regulate to protect the health and safety of our citizens, make sure the cars we drive are safe, the food we eat doesn't poison us. But our regulators have been taking different routes to get to the same end spot. So we've been working to see where we can work together. Because if you're a small business, it's a lot easier to produce to one standard than two. And it allows us to trade more freely across the borders. But we have a long shared border, and we've got programs in place, and we continue to look for ways to increase security. We share intelligence. We have the Great Lakes, as well as maritime borders. And the Great Lakes border is as long as the U.S.-Mexico border. And it's pretty hard to build walls or anything like that in the Great Lakes. What we've done is we do integrated border enforcement teams, or ship rider, where a U.S. Coast Guard vessel will go out with a specially trained RCMP officer, a Mountie, on board, and if the arrest of a suspect takes place in U.S. waters, Coast Guard leads, that same boat can chase them into Canadian waters, and then the RCMP officer would lead, and vice versa. We have Coast Guard officers serving on Canadian vessels. Again, it's how do we make this border more secure? Because whatever is a threat to one country is a threat to the other. So we've been working together. It's not very visible. It's not day-to-day news, but it's something that's been very effective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, we're talking, we're talking about the Canadian-U.S. Kentucky partnership,
Yeah.
but we could be talking about the Canadian-U.S. partnerships with Mexico, with with Bolivia, with China, with India. We're just talking about this as sort of a microcosm of trade activities going all around the world. This is happening in every spot of the world, just about. And so it's not just limited to us at this point. The one thing I'm very curious about with the how many people, do we have an idea of how many folks, how many people are employed directly in international trade activities, let's say in the United States or in Kentucky, as far as in comparison to Canada, how many of your folks, your citizens, are employed in the industries up there because of international trade?
Well, with Kentucky, there's over 100 Canadian businesses who have direct investments here. And those businesses are employing around 9,500 people. But the trade we do back and forth, whether it's a Toyota Camry or a Corvette or something like that, a percentage of the jobs for each of those factories depend on trade with Canada. And our best estimate, looking at the direct investment and the two-way trade, is about 112,000 Kentuckians rely on, their jobs depend on trade and investment with Canada. If you want to look at the U.S. as a whole, it's over 9 million Americans depend on trade and investment with Canada. So it's in both our interest to make sure that trade continues to run smoothly. And that was a key focus of the Prime Minister's meeting with the President, is how do we improve it? Yeah.
Which is very important, extremely important. Well, as you look into the future or into your crystal ball or over the horizon, what do you see as the chief challenge as far as something that could arise that will maybe impede international trade or something like that? Is there something out there that we can work on now to promote international trade and to make it more efficient and more effective?
Well, I'm not good at crystal balling.
I'm not either, to be quite honest.
There is a certain tendency toward protectionism and dissatisfaction with the current systems, whether it's through Brexit, whether it's through election campaigns, not just in the U.S., but we're seeing some of it in Europe. What we're looking at, what Canada hopes will happen, is that people will see the benefit of two-way trade and make sure that when they're trying to react to a certain situation, that they're not making the situation worse. As you said, I'm an expert on trade negotiations, trade policy. I was asked at the World Affairs Council yesterday if it's possible to make trade agreements simpler and easier. And that might be a little bit difficult because they're very complex agreements dealing with a lot of specific circumstances. But I think it's incumbent that we go out and explain the basics of international trade, the basic rules, which is in a free trade agreement, you're trying to bring most of the trade down to zero tariff, so goods can cross the border easily. That once you're inside, your good is inside another country, it gets treated the same as if it had been produced in the country. That you regulate for legitimate purposes like health and safety, and you don't put in stray regulations to keep somebody else out, because we're both benefiting from two-way trade. And if there's effects on the population, Canada has a way of helping the affected sectors through retraining and other methods to make sure that there will be some people affected. How do you limit? How do you dissipate? And at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about coal miners. Now, a lot of the effect on the coal industry is coming from worldwide influences. But when I was talking to the Lieutenant Governor last fall, she talked about how former coal miners being retrained in the aerospace industry turned out to be extremely good at it, something that people hadn't initially thought. And so there are options out there. The question is, how do you do it?
That is very, very true. Well, Canadian Consul General, excuse me, Douglas George, this is an extremely important topic, and it is one that international trade's been going on ever since two humans, one on each side of a national or international boundary, started dealing with one another. And these are problems that can be solved, and we just need to work on them in a concerted effort because it's so very important that trade flow freely and that you have people who benefit from high-paying trade jobs. And of course, you're working on that, folks in the United States and Kentucky and throughout your 10 provinces and 3 territories in Canada. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Thank you. We'll do it again in 2.5 years or sooner.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.